Wyoming Territory, 1884. The saloon doors slammed open like a gunshot, and every head turned just as Bernice Calloway threw her arms wide and hollered. "Now that's what I call weather fit for dancing." Her voice echoed off the timber walls like a whip crack. She laughed loud, unashamed, and full of life. The room, full of dust and men, stiffened. A few poker players muttered. The bartender rolled his eyes. One woman near the back whispered something sharp to her friend, and both stared at Bernice like she had dirt on her face. Bernice did not care. She never had, not really. She had grown up in a mining town where noise meant life, and silence usually meant something had gone wrong. She liked to laugh, to talk, to live out loud. But ever since she had come to Dry Creek to help her widowed aunt run the general store, the whispers had only grown louder. "She talks too much. She is too bold. She is too loud." She had heard it all, and most days she let it slide, but today the words stung more than usual. Maybe it was the silence that followed her entrance. Maybe it was how not a single man in the room even looked her in the eye. Like she was a storm to be avoided, Bernice walked straight to the bar and slapped her coin down. Whiskey. And none of that watered-down stuff, either. The bartender poured without a word. She turned to face the crowd, leaning her back against the counter, and let her gaze sweep across the room. That was when she noticed him. He was sitting alone at the corner table, boots stretched out, hat tipped low. A red bandana was tied at his neck, dust from the trail still clinging to his coat. He looked like he had just ridden in from somewhere far off, someplace where the wind carried stories and the sun had no mercy. He met her eyes and smiled, a real smile, not the kind that mocked, not the kind that tolerated, just warm, easy, and sure. He stood and walked toward her, boots heavy on the floorboards. The crowd went quiet again, watching up close. He smelled like horse and leather and pine. His voice was deep, soft, and slow when he said, "That was quite the entrance." Bernice raised an eyebrow. "You got a problem with how I walk into a room?" He leaned his elbow on the bar beside her, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "No. I think that's the sound of a woman living." She blinked. "What did you say?" "I said," he repeated, "that's the sound of a woman living, and I reckon this town could use more of that." Bernice stared at him, not sure whether to laugh or cry. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Not once. He held out his hand. "Tobias Jennings, folks call me Toby." She took it. "Bernice Calloway, pleasure." They shook. His hand was warm. "So, you from around here?" she asked, searching his eyes. "Not exactly. Just finished driving cattle up from Texas." "Thought I might stick around a bit." She tilted her head. "Why here?" He looked at her like it was the simplest answer in the world. "Something tells me this town just got interesting." That night, Bernice walked home with her cheeks burning, not from shame but from the way he had looked at her. Like she was not a handful, like she was a sunrise. The next morning, Tobias was at the general store before she had even unlocked the door. "You opening up?" he asked, thumb hooked on his belt. Bernice set down the key and eyed him. "You need something," he shrugged. "Thought maybe you did." She tried not to smile. "I can carry a crate, Cowboy." He leaned against the post. "I do not doubt it, but maybe I just felt like seeing you again." And from that morning on, Toby kept showing up. He was never loud, never pushy, just steady. He helped her with shipments, walked her home in the early dusk, shared stories from the trail. He listened, really listened. And when she talked too loud, laughed too hard, or clapped her hands when something delighted her, he never flinched, he just smiled. One afternoon, a customer made a snide comment after Bernice told a story about her childhood in Colorado. Something about how a lady should not laugh like a schoolboy. Bernice froze, the words scraping her like a knife. Tobias turned from the shelf he was stacking and said, calm as thunder, "If you do not like the sound of joy, maybe you ought to shop somewhere else." The man left in silence. Bernice stood there, heart hammering. Later, they sat on the back steps of the store, the sky turning gold. "You did not have to do that," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, I did." She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "You really do not mind it, the way I am?" Tobias took off his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. "I have been across half the country. I have seen deserts, mountains, rivers that stretch further than a man can ride in a day, but nothing has ever sounded more alive to me than you laughing." Bernice looked at him, really looked at him. She reached for his hand and he let her. That night they did not talk much. Just sat there watching the sky. But when she finally rested her head against his shoulder, he touched her hair like it was something he had waited his whole life to do. And in that quiet, she realized something. She had never felt more heard. The wind pressed hard against the windows that morning, carrying with it a fine silt that settled into the corners of the general store like stubborn memory. Bernice stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled to her elbows, tallying ledgers with her thumbs smudged in graphite. The bell above the door rang once low and hollow, and she looked up to find Tobias stepping inside, shoulders dusted with snow. "You rode in this?" she asked, reaching for the rag tucked in her apron to wipe down the counter. "I've ridden through worse," he said, removing his gloves with practiced ease. "Figured you might need help bringing in the flour sacks before the road ices over. They were delivered yesterday." Tobias blinked, then nodded once. "Then maybe I just came to see if you've got coffee." She gestured behind her toward the stove. "Only if you don't mind it strong enough to take the varnish off a chair." He sat on the stool nearest the counter, hands warming near the iron stove. "That's the only kind worth drinking." Bernice poured 2 tin cups and slid one across the counter to him. His fingers brushed hers, and neither of them pulled away too fast. "I've been thinking," he said after a sip. "This town's likely to grow once the railway extension comes through." She gave a short laugh. "That's what folks said 3 years ago. All it brought was 2 more saloons and a lawyer who skipped town in the night. Still," he said, voice slow, "it's a place a man could settle if he had reason." Bernice watched the steam rise from her cup. "You think you'd stay? I'm thinking about it." She didn't answer right away. The room sat quiet but for the ticking of the wall clock and the hiss of the stove. Outside, the wind dragged a shutter open and closed again. Tobias set his cup down. "I know you don't need looking after. I wouldn't insult you by offering it." She turned toward him, one brow raised. "But I've seen you carry those crates alone and still have enough left in you to barter 5 cents off a shipment of nails. I've heard the way you talked to that boy who lost his pa last winter. You got more weight on your shoulders than you let on." Her arms folded across her chest, but she didn't speak. "I just want to stand with you," he said. "If you'll let me." She looked at him a long time, then walked to the front window and pulled the curtain back with 2 fingers. The snow was falling now, steady and thick. The street was empty. "You ever built anything?" she asked. "Fences, mostly. A few lean toss. Why?" "I bought a strip of land north of town," she said. "Thought about putting up a house, nothing fancy, just something that's mine." Tobias stood slowly. "You tell me what kind of roof you want, I'll cut the lumber myself." Her fingers let the curtain fall. "It's a cold day to be making promises." "I don't make them unless I mean to keep them." Bernice looked over her shoulder. "There's a maple tree on that land," she said. "Half the town thinks its cursed roots twist up like a hand reaching for something it can't hold." He stepped closer. "What do you think?" "I think it's not cursed. I think it's stubborn." Tobias nodded once. "Then I'll build your house so that tree's in view from the porch." She didn't smile. But she didn't look away. Later that afternoon, they walked the edge of her land together, boots sinking into the snow-blanketed grass. He didn't ask questions. He simply listened while she pointed out where the garden would go, where she'd string a clothesline, where she might keep hens. When they reached the ridge where the maple stood, he took off his glove and pressed his bare palm to the bark. The wind had let up and the sun glinted off the branches like glass. Bernice watched him, arms crossed tight against her coat. "You believe in second chances?" she asked. Tobias turned. "Only for people who have done something to earn them." She nodded slowly. He stepped toward her, quiet on the snow. "You think you've done something that needs forgiving?" She looked out at the horizon. "Not forgiving, just being heard." He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. Their fingers closed together, warm against the cold. "You are," he said. She glanced at him, eyes uncertain. "You are heard," he said again, quieter this time. They stood there until the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the white. And when they walked back down the hill, they left footprints side by side, close enough that the wind couldn't find a way between. The frame went up in early March, when the wind still held its teeth, but the frost had begun to retreat from the soil. Tobias hammered each beam into place with a deliberateness that made Bernice watch from the edge of the field longer than she meant to. She kept her hands busy marking ledgers, measuring curtains, trading out seed packets, but her eyes drifted north, always to that rise where the house was taking shape. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and the last nails of the porch steps were driven in, Tobias leaned back on his heels and dusted his palms on his trousers. "You've decided on paint?" he asked, rising slow. "I'm thinking blue," Bernice said, stepping up from the path with a basket on her hip. "Like cornflowers, not because it's proper, but because I want it to look like something that was chosen." "Then it'll be blue," she handed him the basket. Inside were 2 enamel plates, a slab of bread wrapped in cloth, and a jar of early apple preserves. He looked at her without reaching for it. "You feeding me now? I figured you'd worked long enough today not to go home empty." They sat on the porch boards, legs stretched out, eating with their hands and listening to the whistle of meadowlarks in the grass below. The house behind them was still just rafters and promise, but it cast a shadow that felt like the beginning of something. "You ever think about before?" she asked, voice low. He wiped jam from his thumb. "Before what? Before this?" "Before cattle drives and store ledgers and strange towns that don't know what to make of people like us." "I don't look back much," he said. "Used to, but it always led me in circles." Bernice turned her face toward the wind. "I used to think if I could just be quieter, softer, maybe I'd fit better. But when I tried, I felt like I was disappearing." Tobias didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I knew a man in Abilene once, never spoke unless he had to. Folks said he was wise. But his wife left him for a fiddler who never stopped talking. Sometimes quiet doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it means no one's listening." Bernice looked at him. "And you, what do you need?" He took a breath. "I need honesty. I need someone who says what they mean and means what they say. I don't like guessing where I stand." Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. "I talk too much when I'm nervous. I listen when I care." They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't empty. The sun tipped behind the hills and the first stars blinked awake. Tobias leaned back on his elbows and looked up. "My mother used to tell me the stars were just holes poked in the sky so the light could get through," he said. Bernice nodded toward the east. "Then that one there must be the biggest hole of all." "Because I've never seen anything brighter." He followed her gaze. "Maybe it's a sign." "Of what?" "That something's coming, something worth staying for." She rested her head on her knees. "I don't want to be anyone's obligation." "Good," he said. "Because I don't want to be anyone's duty." She turned to him. "And what would you be?" He looked at her steadily. "I'd be the man who builds something with you, not for you, not despite you, with you." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. The wind lifted the hem of her skirt as she stood. She offered her hand. He rose without hesitation. They stood there, facing the bare bones of the house, the stars above them clear and indifferent. Bernice took a breath that filled her chest all the way to the ache. "I don't want to do this halfway," she said. "You won't have to." They didn't kiss. Not yet. That would come later when the roof was on and the windows shut out the chill. But the way they stood close enough that no wind passed between them was the first step in a promise neither of them needed to say aloud. And that night, when she walked back toward town with Tobias beside her, she didn't look over her shoulder once. By late April, the ridge grass had turned lush, green with spring's quiet insistence. The house stood firm now, roof shingled, walls sealed, a porch wide enough for 2 chairs, and the kind of silences that didn't need filling. Tobias spent the evenings setting each floorboard into place by lantern light, while Bernice stitched curtains by hand in the back of the store blue calico for the kitchen, muslin for the front room, linen for the bedroom that would soon be theirs. That morning, as Bernice knelt in the dirt behind the store planting green beans along a string line, her aunt came around the corner with a folded letter in hand and a look Bernice hadn't seen on her face since the funeral last summer. "I didn't open it," her aunt said, offering the envelope. "But it's from your sister." Bernice wiped her hands on her skirt and took it. The handwriting was neat, Colorado postmark. She read it slowly, lips moving just enough to shape the words. Her jaw tightened halfway through. When she reached the end, she folded it once, then again, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Her aunt didn't press. That evening, Tobias arrived with a crate of window glass wrapped in burlap. She met him at the porch, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "My sister's coming," she said. "Next week." He set the crate down with care. "You expecting that? It's not a visit." Bernice's voice held no tremble, but it was flatter than usual. "Her husband got a job in Cheyenne. She says they'll pass through and stop a day or two." Tobias leaned against the porch rail, dust on his sleeves. "You want them to?" "I don't know," she said, then gave a bitter laugh. "No, I do know, I don't, but it doesn't seem to matter." He waited. "She's the one they always liked," Bernice said. Soft-spoken, dainty, never raised her voice in public, the kind of woman men offer chairs to even when she's standing. "You're not her." "I know." He didn't speak, but his presence settled beside her like the weight of something dependable. "She used to tell me I made people tired," Bernice said. "Said I wore them out just by being in a room too long." Tobias studied her face like it was something he was still learning by heart. "You think she's right?" "I think I used to believe she was." He stepped closer, boots on the porch slats. And now Bernice looked down at her hands, still stained with soil. "Now I think I was trying to shrink into something I never was, just so I wouldn't be left behind." He reached out, brushing a bit of dried mud from her wrist with a tenderness that felt deeper than words. "You want me to be there when they come?" he asked. "No," she shook her head. "I need to do this standing up. Then I'll be close by, just say the word." When the day arrived, the sky was gray and close, clouds low enough to make the world feel smaller. Tobias stayed at the house, planing the pantry shelves with the door wide open so he could hear the sound of anyone riding up the trail. Bernice wore a slate-colored dress with a high collar and left her hair down, not because it was fashionable, but because she liked the way the wind moved through it. She met her sister outside the store, arms folded, chin lifted. "Bernie," her sister said, stepping from the wagon, "you look." "Well," Bernice inclined her head, "I do." Her sister's eyes flicked to the north where new shingles caught the dull light. "That yours?" "It is." The husband climbed down, offered a brief nod before helping unload the trunks. Her sister glanced at the ridge again. "You really plan to live out there?" "I already am." There was no contempt in the question, just disbelief, like someone who couldn't imagine choosing anything that hadn't already been decided by someone else. They spent the afternoon in brittle conversation. Her sister picked through the store shelves like she was cataloging flaws. Her husband said little. By supper, Bernice had stopped trying to make the silence comfortable. When Tobias came through the door near dusk, carrying a sack of flour and smelling of cedar dust, her sister's eyes widened. Bernice met his gaze and gave a single nod. That was all. He tipped his hat to the room. "Evening," her sister blinked. "You're the one building that house?" "Yes, ma'am. I thought maybe you were helping." She looked from Tobias to Bernice. "Didn't think someone like you would be so." Settled, Tobias looked at Bernice, then back at her sister. "It's not settling when it's what you want." Later, after the wagon pulled away and the dust had settled, Bernice let her shoulders fall. They stood behind the store where the light from the kitchen window spilled onto the grass. "She never asked what made me happy," Bernice said. Tobias reached for her hand. "Some folks don't know how to ask. I think I'm done trying to explain it to them." He brought her fingers to his lips. "Then don't." She looked up at him, the lines around her eyes softened by twilight. "I want to put the table by the west window," she said, "so we can watch the sun go down while we eat. I'll build the chairs to match." And just like that, the ache of the day passed. Not gone, but dulled to something she could carry. The wind came up softly, brushing past them like breath. Bernice leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her without needing to be asked. They stood that way until the light went out in the kitchen, and the stars blinked down like they always had, quiet, constant, and entirely untroubled by who made noise and who didn't. The first day of May broke warm and windless, rare for the Wyoming Territory, and the lull in the air carried a hush that made the birdsong feel nearer than usual. Bernice stood barefoot on the front porch of the house, her skirt hem brushing the tops of her feet, watching the light creep across the floorboards Tobias had laid by hand. The wood held the sun like it had been waiting for it. Tobias stepped out behind her, still pulling on his suspenders, hair damp from the basin. "You always up before the rooster?" "I like the quiet before things start needing me." He came to stand beside her, elbow brushing hers. "You ever think about what it means to be needed?" She turned her head. "You mean how it can feel like a gift or a weight, depending on who's doing the needing?" "I meant how you've never once asked for anything, and somehow still give everything." She looked down at her hands, calloused now in places they hadn't been months ago. "Maybe I just didn't know how to ask. You do now. I think I'm learning." He kissed her temple and left it at that. Later, Tobias hitched the wagon and they rode into town to file the land papers. The clerk, an older man with a crooked tie and ink-stained cuffs, raised his brows when Bernice signed her name beside Tobias's on the deed. "She's the owner," Tobias said, and he didn't use any tone but truth. They picked up a bolt of fabric for a bed quilt after that, and a small oil lamp with a painted chimney. Bernice stood in front of a shelf of seed packets longer than she meant to, fingers tracing the labels. When Tobias came up behind her, she held up two. "Cucumbers or squash?" He tapped her right hand. "Cucumbers, easier to pickle." They spent the afternoon laying stones around the base of the house for a root cellar. Tobias dug clean and steady. Bernice pulled up her sleeves and passed him bucket after bucket of soil, both of them dusted in effort by the time the sun dipped low enough to burn the tops of the grass gold. He brushed her cheek with the back of his knuckle. "You've got dirt here. Then I must be doing it right." That night they ate by lantern light at the table Tobias had built from leftover fur. The chairs creaked just enough to feel real. She lit the lamp, and the painted glass sent soft color across the wall. "I've been thinking," he said, folding his hands. Bernice raised her eyes from her plate. "You said once you didn't want to be anyone's obligation. That's still true?" "I remember." "Well, I'd like to ask you something. And it's not out of duty or guilt, and it's sure as anything not a rescue." She set her fork down. "I'd like to marry you." Her breath caught in her throat. "I want to build a life with you, not just the house, the days inside it, the things we grow, the people we feed. And I want your name to be the one on the door, not just on the papers." She looked at him for a long heartbeat, then reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "You're not asking me to change." "No, I'm asking you to keep being exactly who you are." She nodded once, her voice low. "Then yes. And not because I need to be saved or softened or made smaller, but because you make me feel like I finally fit in the space I take up." They married under the maple tree that summer, just the preacher, a few neighbors, and a breeze strong enough to lift the hem of her skirt. Bernice wore a cream-colored dress her aunt had helped sew, and Tobias wore his best shirt, collar pressed flat with a heated stone. After the vows, they served blackberry pie and fresh bread under the open sky. In the months that followed, the garden flourished. The cucumbers climbed the trellis, and the bees found their way to the squash blossoms. Tobias built a small coop, and Bernice traded eggs in town for coffee and thread. The general store passed into her cousin's hands, and her aunt moved south to stay with kin, leaving Bernice with a letter pressed in lavender and a quiet blessing. They added a rocker to the porch and spent evenings there, shelling peas or watching the storms roll in across the flats. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. But always they sat close enough that no wind passed between them. Tobias read aloud by lamplight in the long winter nights, his voice steady as snowfall. Bernice sewed a quilt that took her the better part of 2 seasons, each square stitched with care, each corner lined in the blue she'd once chosen for the curtains. They never chased anything more than what they had. A house they'd built together, a life that fit them without squeezing, and a love that had grown not from grand declarations, but daily, through quiet choice. One evening in early spring, as the grass turned green again and the breeze carried the scent of thawed earth, Bernice leaned her head on Tobias's shoulder as they rocked in silence. "I never thought I'd be someone's home," she said. "You're mine," he answered, and that was enough. "It always would be."